Hi, everyone. My name is Neil, and I'm honored to be part of this year's Slender for Gender. First off, thanks to Rain and everyone else at Slender for Gender for not only having me, but being open to a pre recorded talk. I wish I could join live, and I might be able to at the very end, but it also means that I get to engage in some fun editing techniques. I wanted to open things up with an incredibly annoying but necessary conversation. What is queerness anyway? Whether I like it or not, I'm an academic. I am an assistant professor of fine art at the University of Cincinnati, where I teach courses in both art theory and practice. Even something as universal and ubiquitous as art can be treated as a form of scholarly research, for better or for worse. Part 1. Baby's First Queer Theory. To start this section off, I go to every gay humanities grad student's favorite person, the late Jose Esteban Munoz. In his most famous work, Cruising Utopia, the then and there of queer futurity, Munoz offers one of the most poignant definitions of queerness to date. In his opening lines, he says, quote, "Queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet queer. We may never touch queerness, but we can feel it as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us as an ideality that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine a future." For those unfamiliar, Munoz's writing is as poetic as it is academic, in that it creates meaning through abstraction. Here, Munoz is starting his book by making a fierce claim that queerness is not something that currently exists, but something that is just out of reach, both in the past and the future. He sets up a metaphor of queerness as the horizon. We can see and document the horizon, we can move towards it, and we can even reach things beyond it, but we can never reach the horizon itself. For the purposes of this essay, Munoz offers a concept of queerness that is an ideal and something to be reached for. It is utopic, a perfection of ourselves, our bodies, and our artwork that is inherently impossible to reach, yet worth reaching towards. A few bits of cultural context to help explain his standpoint. This was originally written and published in 2009, which is the same year that Slender Man was created. I like to think that Munoz knew that Slender Man existed. But more importantly, this was a book-long response to Lee Edelman's own queer theory polemic, No Future, Queer Theory and the Death Drive, published in 2004. We don't have time to dive into Edelman and what is called the anti-social turn of queer theory in the 90s and early 2000s, but to be brief, Munoz challenges Edelman's assertion that queerness is antithetical to the future because, according to Edelman, to be queer is to have no future. In Edelman's eyes, queerness is counter to what he deems the child, a normative archetype of heteroculture that conservatives are always manifesting when creating regressive legislations and policies.
Won't somebody please think of the children?
Munoz, on the other hand, argues that queerness is inherently about the future, and that is especially the case for queer people of color who require a sense of futurism and utopic hope in order to survive and imagine a better future. It's much more complicated than that, but it's important to acknowledge context, especially when riffing off of what is effectively a book-length clapback to another theorist. All of this preamble to say queerness is a possibility. If hetero society is one full of structures and expectations, then queerness defies that by arguing there are no structures, or that they have no meaning to us. Unlike hetero society, which has set timelines of expectations like going to college, getting married, having children, and so on, queerness exists in the future and past, and allows for wiggle room in the present. Queerness looks at the structure, says, no thank you, and breaks it down for parts to create something new. So then, all of that put out there, how does queerness relate to unfiction? For the sake of brevity, I'm just going to steal a definition from Nick Nocturne in his 2020 video on the subject.
A form of fictional storytelling that utilizes varying measures of interaction, immersion, or multimedia delivery beyond the traditional bounds of the mediums used to conduct an experience under the role-playing premise. This is not a game.
There's something in that definition that screams out to me that will be the basis for the rest of this essay, beyond the traditional bounds. Given our definition of queerness is a form of boundary and structure breaking, could this mean that all unfiction is inherently a form of queer storytelling? Perhaps. Let's unpack that a bit. Part 2. Queerness as a challenge. Inherent to queerness is the resistance to definition and being held down in one place for too long. Much like how the word queer itself was once a slur and can still be used as one in certain contexts, it ebbs and flows in and out of our grasp. Yet, one thing seems to remain a constant. Queerness is when things thought to be inherent to human life are intentionally challenged, whether that is who one loves, what one does with their body, or how one structures their life. What is queer in one decade may become normalized in the next, but the challenge of queerness will persist to something new. It truly is the horizon that can be seen from both sides, past and future, yet never fully present. As such, if we were to dissect the concept of queerness within unfiction, we would first need to create the underlying structure that unfiction lives within. Unfiction itself can be seen as a queer form of storytelling in that it eschews traditional structures of narrative through transmedia and interactive approaches. Yet, I argue this is a similar case to rectangles and squares. Unfiction may be a queer form of storytelling, like all squares are rectangles, but not all unfiction itself is queer, like how not all rectangles are squares. Let's first consider the simplest way queerness can exist in a story, through a queer character or creator. Queerness can make itself known as a part of a narrative through the identities of its characters or its creator. Yet, simply identifying as queer wouldn't be enough to push the narrative into the world of being a queer story. Remember, our definition of queerness orbits around structure. So while the actions of characters might be queer in the context of the world we live in, if the structure of their narrative follows rigid storytelling conventions, it might not make sense to call the work itself queer. Consider the amount of theoretically queer characters that Disney has introduced in recent years. Does LaFoe dancing with another man for all of 5 seconds at the end of the live-action Beauty and the Beast make it a queer film, or even that a queer moment? What about the Cyclops lady from Onward? For the identity of the creator or character to make the work queer, it would have to be integral to the story in some way, shape, or form, beyond being a story beat or element of an arc. If we're staying in the world of conventional film, one could argue Dean DeBlas' How to Train a Dragon falls into the category of a queer work that is made queer by the identity of its creator meshing with the content of the film. Throughout the story, Hiccup bucks the centuries-old tradition of dragons and humans being segregated, is disowned by his family once he is forcibly outed as a dragon lover, and at the end, dragons and humans integrate themselves into seemingly chosen familial relationships, not bound by blood, but by affinity. DeBlas' identity as a gay man probably wasn't crucial to reading queerness into the film, but it certainly adds a layer of authenticity and credibility to this take. An incredible example of both queer storytelling and queer-centric narrative comes in one of my favorite pieces of unfiction, Daisy Brown. Not only does it have an underlying essence of queerness through its camp aesthetics and Daisy herself existing in an unconventional manner, but the narrative itself also heavily invests in queer ways of storytelling. It is crucial to utilize YouTube's captions while watching this series, as creator Jules Dapper injected meta-narrative content in legible ways through the captions. This metatext sometimes offers inaudible responses to Daisy's monologues, creating a voice and text dialogue in the process. Other times, it creates a form of time travel by giving the viewer insight into conversations between characters occurring in the past. Daisy had a Twitter account that posted between episodes and offered direct interaction between viewer and character, but to me that was an auxiliary form of queer narrative that supplemented the overall story and was not a necessity like the captions are. Alternatively, the way that The Sun Vanished utilized Twitter, especially in its early days, to both tell its stories and interact with the audience, to the point of audience choice dictating where the narrative went through polls, captures the ephemerality of queerness as being not here. Contemporary audiences may read the posts, look at the images, watch the videos, and so on, but the interactive quality of the story is now gone. Completely divorced from queerness in content and presumably creator, Everyman Hybrid's Habit Made Me Do It arc required audience participation in order to further the narrative. Similarly, Jeffiett's 10 tapes incorporated viewer interaction to both advance the story and even determine its ending. Side note, I'll be the first to admit I don't know if anyone on the EMH crew or Jeff yet are queer, but Vinnie, if you're seeing this, I think you're cute and you should say hi. All that in mind, it becomes clear that queerness may indeed be an inherent aspect of unfiction, making all unfiction queer. Hi, I'm Mary Mary, more like, hi, I'm very lesbian. Ben Drowned, more like Ben crowned the next drag superstar. This is not a game, more like this is totally and completely a gay. Yet, it only takes a few steps down this slippery slope to see how this approach to queerness in unfiction might be a tad problematic. And not in the everyone is canceled way, but rather in the saying a word over and over again until it loses meaning way. Part 3. Challenging the existence of queerness. In 2016, I picked up the freshly published nonfiction title, The Estrangement Principle, by artist and writer Ariel Goldberg. In it, they grapple with the term queer as it relates to art, questioning its validity and usage in an increasingly commercial-centric pride world. Quote, queer, in relation to art, constantly reinvents itself. Loosely aligned with a range of identity positions counter to mass culture, queer resembles an umbrella one buys that falls apart shortly after a rainstorm. Anything can be interpreted and argued for as queer. It can be quick to see how the result of queerness's slipperiness can be just as much a hindrance as it is a strength. It's like in The Incredibles when Syndrome wants to make superpowered gadgets widespread so that anyone can be a superhero. If everything is queer, then nothing is queer. Returning to a previous example, How to Train Your Dragon can just as easily be argued as not queer because of its mainstream status as a film, its lack of actual queer characters, and the standard Bildungsroman or hero's journey that the story is structured around. Later in the same chapter, Goldberg continues to pick at the label queer and the damned if you do, damned if you don't situations artists have gotten themselves into. After listing their varied identities and terms they describe themselves with, they say, quote, labels function as a starting point from which to disentangle myself and also to outline the limitations of my perspectives. Sometimes all these perspectives cram into the suitcase of queer, but I struggle with using just one word. Queer has proliferated in usage, all the while aggregating divergent histories. Labeling art and writing queer affirms the power of those who are consistently silenced. The decision not to label art and writing queer could arguably be arrived at through the same exact motivations. Here we see the problem with a term like queer being ever shifting and nebulous. It can be used to simultaneously strengthen and weaken the impact of a work by either connecting it to a vast and diverse history of past queer creations or limiting its potential by cramming it into a monolithic concept that changes based on context. We've talked a bit about queerness as it relates to time, but queerness can even shift in meaning through contemporaneous cultural differences. Western concepts of a strict gender binary are often bucked in non-Western cultures, especially indigenous cultures of the Americas and Polynesia. In modern-day Ghana, kente cloth was not traditionally woven by women, but men, despite textiles and craft being heavily gendered feminine in Western culture. All this to say, does queerness even exist? If queerness is constantly shifting in meaning based on context through time and culture, how can we adequately claim something to be queer? Part 4. A conclusion. Before writing this up, I was working on my annual performance review, which occurred after recording but before editing this, so I'm just going to put how it went here. In academia, it's a way of justifying our values to the university by telling them how much we did in the last year, but also an incredibly useful process where I get to reflect on my goals and plans. This last year in particular has been full of contradictions and difficulty, leading me to splitting myself into multiple personas or identities where I practice. When trying to describe this in my pre-review paperwork, I ended up writing the following. As my work has always been in conversation with the elusive nature of queerness, it only makes sense to take on different personas when making. Queerness defies definition and understanding. It is liminal and possibly utopic. Thus, a queer practice speaks in coded language that ebbs in and out of legibility and understanding. And here's where I make everyone mad at me with the hottest of takes. In many ways, there is nothing inherently queer about Slender Man and the communal nature of his creation.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Let me explain myself. In her 2013 essay, The Anatomy of a Monster, The Case of Slender Man, Dr. Tina Boyer analyzes the creation of Slender Man within the methodology of medieval legends. She offers a unique perspective. While his creation splintered off into a multifaceted mythos from multiple creators' and vantage points, the actual process in which he was made is nothing new beyond the use of the Something Awful forums. Quote, in terms of legend making and oral tradition, social networks have become a focal point of sharing traditional folklore and myth patterns. The shift from oral storytelling to the internet forms of writing, blogging, and videotaping is intriguing because it shows no difference in dynamic. The creation of Slender Man has proved that legend making and telling, even without the direct oral link, obey the same rules of performativity, critique, embellishment, and progression as they do in the oral telling of a story. The audience and the primary story creator share the legend as a performance to stage their ideas of reality and normative social expectations within a construct of bizarre and preternatural circumstances. The only major difference between the traditional legend-making practices of Boyer's historical research and Slender Man is the speed at which his story spread and altered, which can be attributed to the digital nature of his origin. In most other aspects, Slender Man is a typical monster like the European legends that came before him. He's no different from Celtic black dogs or lycanthropes or dragons or other mythical creatures. But if there's one thing I hope you take away from my definition of queerness, it's this. Multiple things can be simultaneously true, even ideas that seem to contradict each other. We must acknowledge the fact that despite everything I just argued, there's something a little queer about Slender Man. He is the physical embodiment of the uncanny nature of the internet, its ability to simultaneously connect people and segregate them, the pleasures and dangers that are possible, the familiar yet strangeness of becoming intimately familiar with another person you've never met. How is that not Grindr? The platform utilizes a silhouette for profiles without photos, an uncanny representation of a body that is both absent and present. Queer people have embraced the internet to connect with one another, especially when IRL connection is prohibited by geography, culture, or other factors. Yet, there is also an inherent implication that the person one is connecting to is not who or what they say they are. It comes as no surprise that, regardless of intention and the inherent gendering of the Slender Man, that queer people would latch onto his essence as a form of liminality. We see a part of ourselves in the way that he is depicted as unknowable, how he cannot be properly documented in photographs or videos as if he cannot be fully captured in a single image, how he instills a sense of wonder and fear in others. There's no queerness within the Slender Man. There is nothing but queerness within the Slender Man. To fully conclude, what makes a thing queer? My argument emphasizes the lack of inherent meaning within the thing, and rather the context surrounding the thing and how the thing does or does not fit within that context is what makes it queer. Put another way, queer is as much a verb as it is an adjective. To make something queer requires action, intention, and purpose. Queerness can also happen implicitly, of course. In many cases, creators may struggle to not create queer things, as it is inherent in their being. I like to think of myself as such a creator, yet I cannot deny there are plenty of moments where my work falls into structures and systems set before me. Unlike other forms of storytelling, unfiction creates active opportunities for queerness to thrive because it is inherently a boundary-breaking and genre-defying form of storytelling. It offers avenues for explorations of queerness that traditional media requires extra effort to capture. Queerness in media is the result of its creator actively seeking to distill experiences from the past to speak towards the future. Queerness is evident in media that demands more from its viewers than static observation. If you want to make something queer, you must first take the risk in demanding more from your audience than other creators. Thank you.